Welcome to Technically, a webinar series dedicated to exploring the technical challenges of making the web accessible. This month, our presenter is world-renowned expert in PDF accessibility, Adam Spencer. And now, our host and moderator, Michael Beck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this February edition of Technically. If we have any new folks with us, I'm Michael Beck, the operations manager at Tenon, stepping in for Carl Groves. And we are very excited this month to have Adam Spencer of AbleDocs, who's one of the world's foremost experts in PDF accessibility. Hello, Adam.
Hey, Michael. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, of course. Today, Adam is going to address one of the greatest misconceptions in the world of document accessibility, namely the statement that my documents need to be WCAG compliant. And he'll explore the similarities and differences in language that needs to be understood when making PDF documents accessible and compliant for PDF UA. So, without any further ado, take it away, Adam.
Super. So thanks again. And yes, some of you may know me from my previous life. I was head of accessibility services at Accessible IT for the last 9 years. And in November, I stepped away from that position and have now moved over to taking over a new firm that was actually an old firm in Europe. So we'll be making a much bigger announcement about that in the coming days and weeks. So forgive me if our slides aren't as polished as they could be. Obviously, I'm sure you can appreciate that there's a whole bunch of things to do when launching the new firm, but it's business as usual. So one of the things that I have always run up against when becoming or speaking about PDF accessibility is that, why do I need to do this? Why do I care about PDFs? What the hell is this PDF UA thing? And why can't I make my PDFs WCAG compliant? And I have spent a lot of time over the last decade making sure that people understand the similarities as well as the differences and why it's important to understand what you need to be asking for when you're requesting your downloadable content to be accessible. We'll walk through this a lot, and I always have a challenge with webinars because it always feels so one-sided, but I assure you we will definitely have time for questions and comments at the end. And if you have any that you'd like to write into the chat panel, by all means, we can work through them afterwards. So I think where we need to start is, let's get the record straight. PDF UA and WCAG 2.1 are not mutually exclusive. They are not mutually dependent, but they are always complementary. So that always becomes a founding place for us. Asking for something to be accessible in a PDF content does not mean that it is not WCAG compliant. But what it does mean is that it's compliant for its specific format, and that's PDF. So why are we still talking about PDF? Well, this is always a great question, particularly when you're talking to a room full of web developers. Contrary to popular belief, PDF is still very, very relevant. PDF technologies predate the internet. We've been working in PDF since the 80s, and since then it has now become really the document format standard and is still used today extensively. There are over 1 billion PDFs loaded to the internet every year. This is validated by Adobe on an annual basis, and that's where you've got to understand that you can't just be a web manager or a content manager and say nothing is going to be PDF. And I will say this, I am not a PDF exclusivist, and I may be coining a new phrase there, but one of the things that we're looking for is how people access content, and it's often forgotten. And I think we get into a very rigid mindset about, I'm really good at this, so this is what I'm going to do. And we've obviously had that kind of a struggle between the web world and the document world over the last 5 years, 6 years, about we've got to eradicate all of our PDF documents. When the federal government in Canada was sued for discrimination against an individual with a print disability, their reaction was to remove all of that content. But that content's still very valuable. And I always go back to a 300-page report. Can we make a 300-page report in HTML? Yes. Should we make a PDF report in a 300-page report in HTML? And the answer is no. Nobody's going to read that type of content. And that's why I'm not here to sing Kumbaya and hold hands with everyone today about different formats. But it's really important to underline the importance of the use of different technologies for different applications and different methods of communicating. If you've ever seen me speak before, I always make the joke about not everything should be a PDF, a web page, or a tweet, and that always kills in Washington, D.C. or on the coasts, particularly with what's going on in the U.S. lately. So that's why we can't ignore the document problem, or the document reality, I should say. PDF's been built upon a platform of trust of the content, and that's a really important concept to understand. When you see a PDF, we can validate whether that is the original content or not. It's why there are so many subsets to the international standard for PDF technology. So things like archiving, things like accessibility, things like engineering drawings, they're able to be trusted because of the way that the file is created. PDF is a very technical standard. It's not something that you just pick up and run with. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges that people have faced when it comes to document accessibility. Everyone's always looked for an easy button, and we're all guilty of it. But the reality is, it is a very technical piece of technology, and that's okay, but you need to understand what those differences are. So when we're looking at organizations who are generating PDF content, the reason that they're doing it is many-fold, and particularly in Europe, documents have to be saved for PDF-A, which is the archive standard, in order to be posted online, because they want that element of trust. So we're able to see that with documents. And one of the really cool things about PDF is that all of these subsets, all of these substandards, PDF-A, PDF-X, PDF-UA, they're all complementary. So there are pieces that may overlap, and there are pieces that may not be fully compliant, but they don't infringe on the ability to either meet those standards or still access the content. And one big thing that I always reiterate, PDF is not owned by Adobe anymore. It is not their product. They are obviously the largest contributor to the product development, but it has been an ISO standard. And starting in 2004, there was an effort from Adobe and the ISO to allow PDF technology to be an ISO standard. So the International Standard for Organizations the International Standard for Organization is really built upon the global market understanding what it is we're talking about. So we have a same language, so that a PDF that's generated in the United States can be accessed by someone accessing it in Australia, Japan, India, doesn't matter. This is what we call a PDF. And unfortunately, there are a lot of organizations who have bastardized their approach to PDF to make it open in a browser, let's say. And I won't name any names, but I'm sure you can, you've either had experience with it or come across challenges when accessing documents loading in browsers. Very popular ones at that. So again, the standard is a living document. It's refreshed. Well, we just published PDF 2 in the spring. And so there's a group of people who get together and work together through the year to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the document format, as well as clients who come across new challenges or new technologies that we can include into PDF. So that's a really big thing to remember. Everything related to PDF is based on its ISO 32000-1 standard, and there are going to be a few numbers that I talk about today, but don't worry. If it's a PDF and it's a compliant PDF, it conforms to ISO 32000. Everything we do after that is a subset to the standard. But what is PDF UA? UA stands for Universal Accessibility. It was a project that was started as early as 2004, where the reality was PDF content was inherently not designed to be accessible. It was designed to be printed and transferred from one machine to another, even predating the internet, so that one print shop could see what a designer had built and it would print off perfectly well the next time. So when UA started being contemplated by Adobe and AIM, which is a US group that works in conjunction with the PDF Association, the goal was to increase accessibility of content within a PDF context. PDF UA is also an ISO standard. It's ISO 14289-1. We are currently working on -2 and hope to have that ratified later this year. It is not exciting to read by any stretch of the imagination. If you're ever looking for a easy way to fall asleep on a long flight, I highly encourage you to take ISO 32000 and 14289. And if you can make it past meal service, you may want to join the committee. We'd love to have you because it is a very technical document. And it's a normative technical standard. And what does normative mean? Normative means that we're providing guidance for developers, typically developers, to better understand what it is they need to know when creating an accessible PDF. It's not, what PDF UA is not, is it's a guide like WCAG itself. It's not really telling you how to do it. It's telling you what you need to do versus what you can't do. And I think that's a very important distinction. UA is a much more technical yes or no, pass or fail kind of a standard rather than WCAG, which, and this isn't a criticism of WCAG. It's more of a, if you're running into this, you should be looking at that. Whereas PDF UA is, if you have this, you must do this, or you should do that, or you may not do this. And it's very technical. It also provides consistent guidance for achieving accessibility within a PDF context. And there are 3 pieces to the UA standard that are really important. We're not just focused on the document itself. What we're focused on is how a file is going to be created and accessed, how a piece of adaptive technology is going to access that content, and how a viewer, like Adobe Reader, Adobe Acrobat, Nitro's Reader, even a web browser, is going to present that content. And it's got to be presented in a consistent way. Again, we get back to that consistent experience from a user's point of view, as well as from a technology's point of view. We want as many applications to be able to understand the file, interpret the file, access the content within the file, and obviously provide it to someone in a meaningful way, regardless of how they're accessing that document. And as I said earlier, it's an additive spec for ISO 32000. So again, a PDF UA file, in order to conform, must also conform to 32000. So you can't have one without the other. So why do we need our own spec? Why can't we just leverage WCAG and say, Bob's your uncle, we'll use the 32 pieces of guidance that are provided by the W3C for PDF? First of all, PDF is not web content. I'm never obligated to post a PDF to a web page. I can create it on my PC, put it onto a USB key, hand it off to Michael, and Michael can read the file. It's a very different mentality to the way that the document is created. The other thing to consider is people don't really author web pages. When you're writing content, you're typically writing it in a different application, whether that be Word or Google Docs or anything like that, and then posting it into a content management system. PDF is very different. We leverage the design on the page, whether that's in Word, Google Docs, or InDesign, and then create, or we distill, a PDF file. So that's one thing that's really important. The way that PDF content is created is different than the way web content is created. And those formats are not created equally. And that's where we've got to look at the differentiations between WCAG and PDF. There are different capabilities within each file type, within each format. And those pieces need to be respected and understood in their given context. When we start to ignore those differences and try to harmonize it, the reality is that's not how people interact with content. So you've always got to remember that. And I think that's gotten lost over the last 5 years. Again, having seen the transition of who's making content accessible and who isn't, it's a very interesting lifespan of content. And I cringe every time I hear, well, we don't need our documents anymore. Not every organization can say that. You obviously need to cull content, but rewriting content that already exists is a very costly and time-consuming process, rather than just making the existing content accessible. So the people who were working around PDF recognized that those unique capabilities needed to be addressed in order to ensure equal access to content. And again, documents do things differently than web content. And the people who we work with now obviously want to make sure that we're providing the best experience for everyone, regardless of the type of AT that you may be accessing the file with. And there's a whole bunch of sub-projects that go on a regular basis trying to figure out how we push the limits of what we can do within a document context. And authors. The reality is, it became very easy for people to file save as PDF, and there are, again, billions of these things floating around the internet and sitting on desktops, and we want to make sure that authors understand that they can make their documents fully accessible and fully compliant. One of the challenges is the guidance around that has been difficult. You can't learn PDF accessibility in a day, but you can learn it in a relatively in a reasonable amount of time if you're prepared to be focused on making that happen. And I think that's one of the things that gets very quickly glossed over. It is hard. It's why services like AbleDocs exist. But understanding how authors can generate content in different applications and still publish it in an accessible way is really an important piece to understand. So going head to head, we are friends, not frenemies. I have been stressing this for at least 8 years. We are not suggesting that one format should win or one format should die. I apologize. I'm in a departures lounge because my flight was late. So forgive me for the background noise. Oops. So this comment of friends and not frenemies is that we've got to really embrace how content is being authored, how it's being distributed, and how it's going to be accessed. And I think too often internal design teams, internal web teams, accessibility compliance officers don't understand the relationship between the two formats, so that they pick one or the other because of a single directive, and that just isn't a sustainable approach. We have to recognize that there is a much easier way forward, and bluntly, a much more cost-effective way forward. We were working with a client a few years ago that was planning on removing all of their PDF content, hiring people to re-author all of that content into HTML because they needed it on their webpage. And it was going to cost them an absolute fortune, whereas we could remediate the PDF content that was already there, make it accessible, make it search engine friendly, make it catalogable for a fraction of the cost. And it boggled my mind that someone would even consider that. But again, the internal advice that they were receiving from constituents was, well, we like web pages because we can access it on our phone. Sure, but you can also access a PDF on your phone. So this is a very, very important piece. PDF UA and WCAG 2.1 have no conflicts. They are complementary. By making your file WCAG compliant, that does not mean it's not PDF UA compliant, and vice versa. There are just different considerations that PDF UA looks at and WCAG 2.1 looks at. It's finding those differences and understanding those differences that really help make a more accessible document. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. And we'll get into what those details are in a minute. But keep in mind, PDF UA doesn't address everything. And I think this is a really important piece. We don't address media. We don't address actions. We don't address scripting. We don't address design. And we don't address content. One of the things that the authors of PDF UA are very conscious of is we don't want to tell someone what they can or can't do with their own content. What we do is provide guidance around how people should be making that content accessible. And when it is a content consideration, we actually recommend referencing WCAG. If you don't know what to do for a video for accessibility, as an example, check what you should be doing in WCAG's guidance around media, particularly captioning and the rest. So those pieces, that's again why we've always found it quite interesting that there was such a reluctance to embrace PDF UA by the W3C historically, as well as whether it was governing bodies or people in the industry. we're not saying that WCAG isn't very valuable in a PDF context, but there's so many more things that need to be discussed above and beyond the 32 guidance techniques. And that's really an important thing. And I can tell you there is an initiative right now that is happening as we speak to unite the two and have WCAG directly reference PDF UA, which is really exciting. And I would suggest it's not just exciting for those of us who care about PDF, but it's also exciting for all content authors, because now there will be an easier way to better understand how to make all content accessible in a digital context, or I should say more pieces of content accessible. And I think that's a really great thing. There was a meeting that was held, or a summit that was held in Edinburgh, Scotland, at the beginning of December, where PDF experts from around the world got together and discussed how we can build canonical references for this is how you make a PDF accessible, or this is how you make this piece of content accessible. And we're going to be authoring or publishing that in the coming months, which is really exciting because it allows people to understand, I've come across this, what do I do with it? And that's a really important piece. So although the language may be a little different, and although PDF UA doesn't address everything, it allows us to have a common bond between the different format types and the different types of content that people are trying to put in. We always laugh in our internal teams about the pieces of content that we receive and how authors are always trying to push the limits of what they can do, whether that's from a graphics, from a design standpoint, embedding new widgets into the format. It allows us to challenge ourselves and say, okay, well, how can we make that accessible? There were a couple of us that were having a conversation at a meeting a few years ago about how we make 3D CAD rendering live and how we also make it accessible. And the cool thing is it's possible. It's not easy, but it is possible. And I always like seeing what else we can do. And quite frankly, that's not something that WCAG touches on. So maybe we'll be able to bring something new to the forefront when that gets hashed out. So the details. Time-based media alternatives, test sensory, and captchas. UA does not address these items. We always recommend addressing WCAG. We can't have those pieces exist within PDF UA. It just isn't how the format works. So we don't have that. Audio and video content. We do include syntactical requirements. So we tell you how to tag something, but we don't tell you what to do with the actual content. That's something that WCAG does much better than UA. And that is not going to change. We will never address what that content accessibility should be. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't have audio-video experts or people with audio-visual disabilities within the committee to help form that guidance. And we didn't feel that it was necessary to reinvent the wheel. If it's already being covered in WCAG, let WCAG continue to manage that. Video captions, we have no guidance around that. And JavaScript design. This is really interesting because JavaScript is very heavily used within a PDF content, or context, rather. However, we do not have a JavaScript accessibility standard included, and that's a really important part because we work so much with it, and it can reference external content. That's why we don't provide guidance around JavaScript. So for any of the JavaScript accessibility requirements, we do suggest accessing or referencing WCAG. So JavaScript and media content, again, PDF UA is not a JavaScript or multimedia standard. So, and that's not to say that WCAG is either, but there's much better guidance around how to make that type of content accessible within WCAG rather than within PDF. Control device specific. We are control device independent. The way that content is accessed within a PDF is very much reactionary, not putting the focus from the page to the user. So it's all about the interactive to the page rather than from the page, and that's a big differentiation. So we don't cover any of that within our spec. And design considerations. This is really interesting, and I will say that this is an area that is most challenged when content is made accessible. And there's two schools of thought here. And when a file is presented to be made accessible by many remediators in the world, our job is to follow the PDF UA specification. And often, unless otherwise specified by the client, that will be it. So if there's, for example, low color contrast, or the type of content put in is an inaccessible piece of content, we won't come back and indicate to the client they should change this. Now, what I will say is that varies country to country, that varies organization to organization. However, it's really important to understand where these changes can be made. PDF isn't like HTML where we can just swap out a CSS script and change the coloring through an entire document. That needs to be done at source. Nobody authors a PDF document, right? You author a Word file or an InDesign file or a PowerPoint deck. And when you're looking at those pieces, you then realize how that content is being created in the authoring environment. That's where the change is made. So unless we're provided with the source file, which is often not the case, it's very difficult to make those changes within the PDF. There are tools that make it easier. There's no question about that. But we can rely on different semantic equivalents. So for example, we can change the way that the page is presented based on certain print disabilities or user requirements, but that has to be done in the viewer, not on the page. And this is a philosophical debate that goes back and forth. And I was actually having dinner with someone the other night, and they said, yeah, we received a document back and the color contrast was awful. And I said, great. You should have spoken to your authoring team and your design group and educated them on how to make a more accessible design. And he said, that's a really interesting point, because we expect that to be done later in the process, whereas in the document world, we expect it to be done much further upstream. And so I think this becomes one of the interesting debates, and I don't know whether we will ever find true consensus on how that comes through, but that's always the conversation. And I will say personally, we're happy to make those alerts happen, but it becomes really, it is a much bigger challenge in a PDF context than an HTML context for those visual appearances. So what we look at, for example, if there's a bar graph with very low color contrast, or the sizing of the text is poor, we have been known to embed tabular content behind the image, which could be a much more accessible option rather than relying on low color contrast and grainy quality imagery. Although a table can sometimes pose challenges for some, it's actually a really easy way to access that content if the table is tagged correctly. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen over the years, just sticking on content. PDF UA worked really hard to make sure that even complex content could be made accessible and navigated easily. And there was a period of time where people providing training were saying, simplify your content, make it easier, and don't have complex tables. And I will push back on that quite strongly, because it's not the case that content authors can do that. When you consider things like financial tables and annual reports, you can't simplify that table. In fact, it would be illegal to simplify that table because of reporting requirements. But people were providing that guidance because they didn't know how to make the table itself accessible, or authoring tools weren't able to generate completely accessible structures. So you're all of a sudden telling an author how to create content without understanding the way that content could be presented to a user if some additional steps were done to the document. And I always, that one always rubs me the wrong way, because I've always felt it's important to make sure that people understood as much as possible about how compliant content can be, even complex content, rather than ignoring all of those pieces because it was hard or they didn't know how to do it. So that's just something that I wanted to add in. And I'm always happy to have a conversation about design considerations any day of the week. Dynamic XFA. XFA is an XML-based form subcategory that has been used for almost 20 years now. that allows for dynamic forms to be created. So things that are responsive to a user's input. And they can be very, very accessible. However, they are prohibited in PDF UA because we can't control them the same way in a PDF context. That being said, they are not prohibited by WCAG. And you can make an XFA PDF accessible in a WCAG compliance framework, but you can't do it in a PDF because of the way that the guidelines are set forward. So when do we refer to UA? And forgive me for all of this text. I will make these slides available, and I'm not going to read this out. I don't believe in reading off slides. So one of the things that we really look for is interoperability, and it's that document of trust. We want to make sure that a PDF is always reliable in the way that it renders, the way that it prints, the way that it's viewed, the way that AT interacts with that content. And WCAG does not normatively address interoperability. It is always going to be our focus to make sure that regardless of what application is accessing the content within the page, we're putting normative guidance around how that should be done. And then it's up to the developers to make sure that their software can do that. And again, it is all possible. However, some organizations don't want to put the resourcing behind making sure that that's done. And I think that really does a disservice to users, because the number of times that a user will open a file and it's still not accessible because the authoring group doesn't know what to do with it is really missing out on that interoperability factor. Because it has been around for so long, PDF remains being that go-to for accessing content or distributing content because of how it shows up. I know that you're going to be able to see the exact same thing that I do, or you're going to be able to access that content in the same way that I'm going to. And I think that's a really key aspect of why PDF UA is so great and why PDF as a format is so great, and really becomes a cornerstone of what we're trying to accomplish. Fonts. Fonts are a fascinating piece of PDF accessibility, and not just from a design standpoint, but from an embedding standpoint. And that section 7.21 is so critical for the accurate conveyance of the author's intent with legibility. What we're able to do is smoothly render that content in any size, which is so important. And yes, there are some fonts that are still not available with that rendering, particularly in dialects. We have some of that challenge with native languages because they may not be true type, and that can cause a legibility problem going forward. The other cool thing is there's some AT that can interact with embedded fonts and convert those embedded fonts. So for people who may have dyslexia, they could then swap in a new font that would be easier to read and still access your content in a way that's much more approachable for them than what the author intended. So even if a user had put a serifed font in place, which can be more difficult for someone to read, a user could then swap that out to a sans serif font and make it that much easier for them to access the content. And I think that's a really great opportunity for content authors to consider general accessibility or a broader accessibility when you've got the ability to allow the user to customize it in the way that works for them. Headings as nav. Most files have headings, and it's really the only feature that allows navigation within the document. The way that we navigate content in UA is really strictly based around heading structure. So we're building that hierarchical order of content, and they've got to be logically ordered. And what that means is you can't go from a heading 2 to a heading 5. The context doesn't make sense for a user. So we're looking for an H1 to an H2 and 3, 4, 5, 6 in that order. And the cool thing in PDF UA 2 is we can actually do it in a nesting way that doesn't limit the number of headings. We used to be limited to 6. Now we can effectively go unlimited with nesting. And that's a really cool thing that allows a user to pull up their heading levels and say, where do I want to go in this document? Some authors will not use a table of contents, for example. Maybe the document's only 20 pages and they feel that they don't need that kind of navigation. But a user of AT does. And so by forcing through UA the document to use that structure to allow an individual to navigate the file using those structures, WCAG doesn't mandate that. And again, you can navigate using buttons and links and all sorts of other anchored referencing, but PDF doesn't have that. So we've got that now. We leverage the heading structure for that type of nav. And article threads. So this is a way for a user, think of a magazine article. Instead of having to go from page 1 to page 25 and read all of the content before, one of the things that PDF UA allows is for articles will actually follow the logical structure. So you can move through an entire story as a combined piece rather than having to try and navigate between see continued story at top of page 7. We can tag the file to follow that rather than just the tag structure. We're following the logical structure and the semantic structure rather than having to find that content somewhere else. So again, something really unique to PDF UA and really based around the print world. And I think you've got to remember that that's where the foundations of PDF are. It's in that print world that allow us to have different pieces of content show up in a logical order, but we're going to be able to, or on a visual order, not necessarily a logical order. So we're able to get around that within a PDF UA content. One big rule, and please take this away. Failing WCAG 2.1 conformance with PDF UA, you will violate UA violating UA file should be considered a violation of WCAG 2.1 or 2.0. The only exceptions to that are included. They are sections 7.4.2, 7.4.3, 7.4.4, and 7.12. None of those are required by WCAG 2.1. And those are the subsections that I went through earlier. If your file is not compliant in a PDF context, it is impossible to be WCAG 2.1 compliant. So those are the pieces that you've got to recognize. I have in parentheses the XMP metadata flag. And what I will say to that is this is a self-reporting piece of metadata that is added by an author of a PDF UA compliant file that identifies the file as being UA compliant. That is not validated by anyone. That is self-reporting. So a user can put that in and say, I'm compliant. However, that doesn't necessarily guarantee it. It's not like a PDFA file format requirement. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And I'm happy to go into greater detail about what the UA XMP metadata flag is. The nitty gritty. If you are looking for a detailed framework, I wasn't going to go through the table side-by-side comparison of WCAG 2, PDF UA, where those subsections can be found in each of the specifications. I thought that may be sleep-inducing, but it is available. This was done, I'm going to say 4 years ago now, by AIM. And you can see achieving WCAG through PDF UA and where we suggest following the guidance of PDF UA versus following the guidance of WCAG. A few pieces have been updated since it was originally authored, but it's a really great resource to just say, can I do this? Yes. How do I apply it? Do I apply it using the guidance that I find from the W3C, or do I apply it using the guidance provided by the ISO? So those are, I thought that could be helpful. And that's me. And we've got 15 minutes for questions and comments and dialogue if anyone would like to have it.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam. First question we have is from Elizabeth. She wants to know if you have an example of a complex table and the quote-unquote fix for it that goes beyond just header IDs.
I do. And Elizabeth, if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to send you one. Part of the challenge is how you add those pieces in. And again, I'd be happy to walk you through that. I will say, and I try not to promote or discourage anyone from using any piece of software. All of the major PDF accessibility tools can do this. Some do it easier than others. So that's one of the challenges that you may run up against. And again, happy to have that conversation.
Perfect. And then Isabella would like to know how to make maps accessible in PDF, like a visual map on a brochure of office locations.
Great question. And we do a lot of maps. I think over time we've probably done about maybe 500,000 maps in our time.
My.
Yeah, it's a lot. We have a client that is very map happy. There's really two approaches, and we worked with some users at the CNIB a number of years ago to try and best determine how to tag a map. And there were a few approaches that we've relied on, and one is obviously tagging the map as an image because it is an image. So by PDF rules, we have to tag semantically. So an image is an image. We don't have a map tag. The alt text approach, so writing the text description of that map is a bit of a fine art. You have to give someone context for where things are. And that does take a little bit of understanding of the map itself, where things are, how could they be geolocated, how could they be referenced. So we often look at bounding area. So if you've got a large map, we're going to show a context. So let's just use the state of New York. If you've got a state of New York, but the office is located in Buffalo and in New York City, we would start by the macro level, say, indicating that this is an image of the map of the state of New York, and indicating that there's an office in Buffalo. We would look to add the actual address if we could, as well as the address to the office in New York, depending on what was being highlighted. We have also been known to add a much more detailed text description behind the image of the map to provide greater detail, particularly on schematical drawings on top of maps. When you're looking at planning documents, they just need more notification to the user, and putting that all in alt text is a really tough usability piece. Obviously, when you can't navigate or pause or rewind that content in the alt text, that's why we like to use the text behind the map. Also, always making sure that you're identifying highlighted pieces, things like things that are identified within a legend, you're identifying those in the map as well. So always tag the legend, always tag the titles, give people as much context, and if the map is very detailed, provide that text behind the scenes and tag it.
Alrighty. Sarah asks, is Adobe Acrobat really the only tool for editing PDFs?
Absolutely not. No, you can. There are really three big ones. Adobe Acrobat. There's an organization known as or called Access4. They have a tool that does a lot of advanced tagging work called Quick Fix. You can also do PDF accessibility in a tool called from Common Look. They have a tagger add-in that leverages Acrobat. Those would be the really top three tools. There are some other subsets of those tools that make it easier, but those are really the big ones. One thing to keep in mind is you can never generate a fully compliant PDF file from source. It's impossible. Microsoft can't do it. Adobe can't do it. There are things that will get you more accessible, but you will always have to do a finishing pass to make sure that your file is fully accessible and compliant. So I'll always look into those. And sorry, it was Sarah was asking for that. Sarah, if you want a full list, and I'm happy to have that conversation with you.
Perfect. And almost like a companion question, what is your favorite tool for checking and verifying PDF accessibility?
I have my own. Well, and a lot of that comes down to because of the way that we generate content and how many documents we make accessible, we needed more advanced tools to deal with that. There has been talk about us releasing it, but our tool is a proprietary one. Previously, we've always relied on Quick Fix and the tools from Access 4. We also have I have a personal relationship with the guys there, so but it's because of the tool there.
Okay. And what about ebooks? How difficult it is to make them accessible?
It is not. Ebooks are actually really easy to make accessible. The question is, what format do you want to keep it in? Are you looking at keeping it in PDF? Or are you looking at keeping it in EPUB? And I don't want to be too commercial about this, but we actually have a tool that can go from accessible PDF to fully accessible HTML and EPUB in about a click. So you really have to decide how you want your content being accessed and read. So that's the piece that's really important to look at.
And that's a proprietary tool of your own?
It's a service that we provide.
The service you provide, okay.
Yep. And actually, it is. We haven't launched it publicly, but if you if you get in touch, we can run a demo and show you.
Okay. So Isabella, go ahead and get in touch with Adam, A. Spencer at abledocs.com. As you can see on the screen, and he's glad to have that conversation with you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, yes, we do. Elizabeth, again, is there a resource that goes into detail about the structure tags? Like what can be a child of what?
On the record, there is not. Off the record, there is. And if you send me an email, I will send it to you. The PDF Association will be publishing that, but currently it has not been ratified. So I'm happy to send that along.
Excellent. Yeah, this was fantastic.
And the rules get very complicated.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. In my previous life as a law librarian, we dealt a lot with governments becoming more about pushing more content out in PDF, and then them using PDFA to make it official and have what do you want to call it? Just to make sure people haven't screwed with it. Authenticated. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that was very interesting for me to hear the technical aspects of that.
And all of the content that we produce for our clients in Europe has to be PDFA as well as PDF UA. So we don't have a choice.
Mm-hmm. I wish that some more domestic U.S. government bodies would do the same.
Agreed.
So that's it. That about wraps it up for this edition of Technically. Thank you, Adam. And thanks again to all of our participants for joining us. We'll have the video of this month's webisode up on our YouTube channel soon. So if you missed something, be sure to check that out. And please share this wealth of knowledge that we've been amassing over the past few months with your colleagues. Next month, we'll have Luis Garcia, the Senior Product Manager for Accessibility at eBay, on to discuss the various color-related WCAG criteria and how fixing one might create issues in other aspects of the site's accessibility. And that will be on March 6th, and we hope to see you all then. Thanks again, Adam, and thanks to Sylvia, ACS, for the captions. And once again, thanks to all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.